Thanks. It's really an honor to be here with you tonight. I come from Tucson, Arizona. I arrived here a couple days ago, and yeah, I'm really grateful to be here and to be able to share some of the research with, particularly this book, Storming the Wall, that connects the dots between climate change, border militarization, and displacement. My apologies to some. I did meet with some students from Speak Out Now a couple days ago, so my apologies to them for repeating of any stories they might have already heard or some of the things that we talked about at that point. But yeah, so I guess I'd like to begin with a story, and the story comes from research that I was doing while researching Storming the Wall. And one of the things that I did, one of the places I went was the Philippines. And I went to the Philippines because that is where my grandmother's from. And my grandmother's from a island called Marinduque, a little bit south of Manila. So when I did go to Marinduque. I went there for the first time after hearing about it all my life and my childhood. I went there for the first time, and I met with, well, I did many things, but one of the things that I did was I met with one of the, I guess they were called, the person was called a disaster specialist. He was looking into like what are some of the hazards that might inflict upon Marinduque, and one of the things that he mentioned was sea level rise, among many, and he pointed out some places where I could go to see it firsthand. And so he said, go to the community Balogo. And so that's what I did. And Balogo is obviously right on the seashore. So I was walking down the seashore, and that's when I saw for the first time a house that had been destroyed by the sea. At that moment, there was a typhoon going on in the northern Philippines, but it was pretty far away, but close enough that the sky was completely gray. There was rain coming down a little bit and a surge of the sea. And with that, the surge was enough that the water was lapping in and out of the house. So I just remember standing there watching the water go in through the front door and go out. But the rest of the house was like a corpse. It had already collapsed. It was already uninhabited. And then I talked to a fisherman just shortly thereafter, and he started talking about how the sea had been encroaching, and he pointed out to a buoy out about 20 feet into the waves, and you could see it rocking back and forth on the waves. And I remember looking at that and then deducing where we are, and I went, wow, that's quite a bit. It was during a surge, but it was definitely a significant amount of space or extension. And then right after I talked to the fisherman, there's a young man walked out to the shore or to the beach, and he was holding a child in his arms, and the child was like on his arms like this. And I kind of suspended that moment because at that time my first child was about to come myself. So I was 4 months away from having my first child. So a lot of, while I was doing the research for Storming the Wall was talking to an unborn person, right? Which really actually played into my thinking in this book. So I was there like simultaneously in the ancestral land of my grandmother, and then thinking about a child. So it's almost like in the time span of 200 years, more or less. But I really like focused on this child, and I wondered because the fisherman had just told me, well, we had to move back our homes because the sea had been coming in. So some of our homes, we just moved them back, and I wondered, what would it be like in 10 years? Because obviously the sea was getting, coming in more and more. What would it be like in 20 years? What would this child's life be like in 20 years? What would they have to move their homes back further? would they not be able to exist there at all anymore? Would the salt water come in and infiltrate the fresh water used to irrigate the rice fields? Would the child have to move to Boac, which is the capital of the province? Would the child have to move to Manila? Would the child have to go across the international boundary without papers and face the razor wire and walls and drones and armed guards and that's proliferating around the world more and more and more and more. So, and with that, I turned to this. I came to the side and just started writing, and that actually turned out to be the first scene in Storming the Wall. But on hindsight, I realized later that was also when climate change for me personally went from something that was more abstract, I guess, to something that was more raw, real, and right now. Maybe I was just missing it all around me before that point, and this was in 2015. But it was that moment where it was just like the raw and realness of it really came to a forefront. And also another thing on hindsight in that moment was now I look at the unborn child who's now 4 years old, and it's become for me something like where I think of where it's way beyond me now, and it's thinking of the future generations and thinking of that child that day on the shore, and thinking of children all over the world. And that's like, as I share like some of the research from Storming the Wall, which some of it can be dire, as I talk about the long range plans of governments to militarize borders, especially. One thing I hope is that that we, with this sort of information, that it could help articulate a counter vision, a counter long-term vision, because that's exactly what's needed right now. And so with Storming the Wall, I did. Philippines was one place that I went to, but I went to many other places, and I'm going to share stories from each of those places. And that includes Central America, it includes where I live on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. I went to the Paris Climate Summit, among other places. But in each of those places, I talked to many different people. I talked to high officials. I talked to people most impacted by what's going on. I talked to people who are impacted by the border situations and people who are creating the borders. And what I tried to do in each place is try to find really compelling stories to illustrate, what is going on and illustrate those points. And that's hopefully how I want to present tonight and share these stories from many different places. Another story from the Philippines is one. I went to a place called Tacloban, and maybe people remember Tacloban in the province of Leyte in the eastern Visayas of the Philippines, and that's where the Typhoon Haiyan hit in 2013. And when Typhoon Haiyan hit, it was the most powerful typhoon ever to make landfall ever. Now it's been surpassed by Hurricane Patricia in 2015, but before that, Haiyan was the most powerful. And one of the people that I interviewed who was there when Typhoon Haiyan hit was a man named A.G. Sanyo. He's a muralist. He has a lot of family from that area, but he's from Manila. But he was there visiting family when they got word that this typhoon had just grown and it looked like it was going to make landfall right in Tacloban. And so, not to burden his family, he said, well, I'm going to go stay in a hotel. And he went and stayed in a hotel near the Bay of Tacloban, about 4 blocks away. So long story short, he wakes up in the middle of the night, or probably like 5 or 6 in the morning, and there's no longer a roof over his head. Water is gushing into his hotel room. The wind is blowing so strongly that he said that he could feel the foundation of the hotel, like this kind of weaving, this going back and forth. And he said that every single crack and crevice, the wind was so strong, it was making a high-pitched whistling sound. And this was going on all around him, and he said, I began to plan my own death. I thought I was going to die. I wondered if my family would find. I wondered if my family would find me in the rubble, on the ground, because that's what the hotel was about to become. He actually didn't. He obviously didn't die because I interviewed him, but he went down to the third. He ends up getting up out of bed and goes down to the third floor. Third floor is where about 60 people are congregated. And that's the only safe place to be. The first floor is totally flooded from the surge. The surge is unlike anything anyone had seen before, ever, in that area. Even when I went a year later, the place, the Tacloban looked like it really had been hit by, it had been bombed by, hit by a hydrogen bomb or something like that. It was that intense, like the destruction. And the first floor was flooded, the second floor, the surge went in the second floor, the fourth floor, obviously, no roof. But the 60 people survived. But the next 3 days, he ended up gathering bodies. As he said, with my own two hands, I gathered 78 bodies. 78 bodies of 6,000, according to the Philippine government, but everyone says they stopped counting the bodies. 10,000 is the more probably accurate count, but others say 15,000. I heard one organization there say 20,000 people killed, and 1 million people displaced. Displaced, like when I went there, a year later again, there was long lines of people trying to get money for their homes that had been completely destroyed. And so when, thinking of Marinduque, right, when you think of life in the status quo right now, what's going to be happening? What are the glimpses of the future? Well, the glimpses of the future are the glimpses of what we're already seeing. The sea level rise, going to my grandmother's island in Marinduque, the superstorms unlike we've ever seen before, like Typhoon Haiyan, is exactly what scientists are saying is going to be, life was going to be on what life is like on this planet in the status quo. And another thing is human displacement unlike we've ever seen before in human history. And with that, I want to turn to Central America. And actually, I always say Central America, but I really mean Mexico. I was in Mexico, in Tenosique, Mexico. I was in Tenosique, Mexico, and it was in June of 2015. Tenosique is in the state of Tabasco. It's about 20 miles away from the Guatemalan border. And I was there for a couple days, but I went to the train yard, and the train yard's where the bestia or the beast, or a lot of people get on the train to head north. And so there's a lot of people congregated in that area. And so I was there, and I started talking to people. And while I was talking to people, I remember seeing a kind of military patrol car go by, and everyone kind of ducked down with 3 soldiers looking into the train yard. And mind you, in 2015, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, but in 2015, Mexico was in the process of really fortifying its southern border with tremendous U.S. pressure. In fact, one U.S. official said in 2012 that our border is no longer our southern border with Mexico. It's now the border between Tabasco or Chiapas with Guatemala. And so you could see that playing out in the train yard, and then I started talking to 3 farmers from Honduras, and the farmers had been in the train yard for about 6 days, and they had plans to go north, and they tried to get on a train the night before, but the train was going too fast, and that was another tactic used by the Mexican government. They called to speed up the train so people could not get on the trains. And even if they had got on the train, that particular train, a mile down the road, there was an immigration checkpoint. So they would have been, had to get off the train. As I talked to people who actually got on the train, and they mentioned that, that there was this immigration checkpoint, and everyone had to jump off and run. But anyhow, I started talking to these farmers, and they began to tell me the story of why they left where they were from in Honduras. And really, it came down to no rain. They said no rain. That was the first. When I asked the question, no rain was the answer. No rain, then with no rain, no harvest, no food, a crisis. And it turns out they were 3 of a million people in this sort of crisis, affecting the entire region. 400,000 approximated by the Honduran government in that particular area. And so it was like one mayor of a community said it was an unprecedented calamity, using those sorts of terms. And talking to climate scientists who are doing modeling in Central America, the droughts that they were experiencing in this community, they've been happening before. They've been happening with more intensity and frequency over the last 10 years. And according to the modeling, if things stay the same, they are predicted to increase in intensity and frequency going into the future. It's so much that one of the climate scientists who I interviewed said, Central America is quote unquote ground zero for climate change in the Americas. And he meant not only the droughts, but Central America is an isthmus. There's oceans on either side. There's huge hurricanes that have spun off those oceans. And so the flooding and mudslides, and you have ranging from lots of precipitation to no precipitation, and that was one of the reasons behind why he said that. And it's proving true. New reports, there's a report that came out about 8 months ago from the World Food Program. And the World Food Program says 2 million people over the last couple of years have been impacted in Central America, particularly in the dry corridor area. The dry corridor area is the area, obviously, where the droughts have been occurring with more frequency. 2 million people have been impacted by these droughts or extreme weather. 1.4 million people to a degree of peril, using the word peril. So it really makes me think, like how many, as I met those 3 farmers that summer in 2015, like how many more farmers in that sort of situation were there? How many more people were leaving because the droughts wilted their crops? They had no longer food to eat. How many have gone there since then? And it's really, when you think about climate change, one of the things that's really difficult is to parse out exactly how many people are, climate change is, because it's really difficult to say, oh, that person is going only because of climate change, because there's often so many factors, as people here surely know, right? That the many factors that contribute to why people are economically marginalized in the first place, right? Lots of economic restructuring that's happened in Central America through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank over years and decades, right? Or the history of military dictatorships and different. You can look at all kinds of different factors. So it's real difficult to ascertain just how many, but what people are saying is that climate change is coming in and exacerbating pre-existing conditions, right? Like if you're a small farmer in the highlands of Guatemala, an indigenous farmer who's been marginalized historically, right? You have no money, and then the harvest, and then the rains don't come, then there's a crisis, and what do you do, right? Do you go to Guatemala City? Do you go to another place? How do you respond to that? And definitely one way people are responding more and more is heading north. And so for the purposes of our conversation tonight, as we look at climate change, I'll try to tell you some numbers, like Mark mentioned, that are being used to try to parse out those numbers of how many people are directly displaced due to climate change. And one such number is the one used by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And they say that at a global level, 22.5 million people per year have been displaced between 2008 and 2015. I've seen numbers, more recent numbers that are even higher, like 25 million or 26 million, but it comes from different organizations, and The methodologies for counting are different. But you could say that 20 million to 25 million people per year, at least. One of the things the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center says is we are not sure how to calculate slow onset climate change factors like drought. So droughts, they're having difficult counting. So given the fact that droughts are a big factor causing displacement, it seems like they might be a drastic undercount. And as Mark mentioned, another thing that's mentioned by these organizations is that more people are being displaced due to climate change than by war. Sometimes by a factor of 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1, sometimes 4 to 1. So that it seems like those trends are getting higher, more and more. And then that's what's happening now. When you look at projections into the future, the projections get even more dramatic. We're talking, if you look at 2050, that's just the even number that many people use. 2050 is a year where you have estimates from 150 million people to 1 billion people that could be displaced due to climate, depending on what you're looking at, depending on the report you're looking at. The numbers are very wide-ranging, and actually they speak to a debate, pretty wide-ranging debate that's going on as far as these projections are concerned. But as one of the researchers who's looked into this, who I interviewed for Storming the Wall, said to me, if things stay the same, it could be anywhere in that number range. But what we can say is that it will be staggering, and the kind of displacement we'll see will be unprecedented in human history. And so you have, as you look at this displacement, at the same time, there's no climate refugee status, right? The definition of refugee is limited to persecution, really. So economic issues nor environmental issues are not included. There's not a country that has a climate refugee status. One exception is potentially New Zealand. New Zealand is, and I keep saying that and I keep forgetting to look it up, but I think New Zealand either has passed legislation, but the legislation is for 200 or 300 people per year. So that's, considering the numbers we put out, that's really a fraction of it. But if they were to do it, that could be a model, maybe. So maybe it's a model, maybe there's some sort of domino effect that could happen, who knows. But as of now, there's not any sort of climate refugee status. And so people that are displaced, that are on the move, a lot of people do, end up close to home or move and try to, like during hurricanes when your home's destroyed, lots of times people move close by and try to salvage their homes, and so they stay close to home. But at the same time, more and more people are moving across borders. And if people are moving across borders and they don't have papers, then what are they going to face, right? They're going to face, most likely, a border regime of some sort. And with that, I'd like to turn our attention to borders. So one thing when you think about climate change, right? You have this, the evidence that it's growing, the impacts of it's growing into the present and going to keep increasing into the future, right? If things stay the same. When you talk about the future, it's difficult because the future, there's so many X factors, it's unwritten, things can very much change. But to make educated guesses right now, and what scientists are saying, if things stay the same, we're gonna see more of the same into the future. And that goes with displacement, and that goes with the climate impacts, and it also goes with borders. Right now, one of the most key statistics that I can share with you that shows this is that when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, on a global level, there was 15 border walls. And today, there are 77 by the last calculation. So 2/3 of those border walls are constructed in post 9/11. So they're being constructed in accelerated fashion and across the world. One example of this is, of course, the United States. The United States has put tremendous emphasis on its borders long, long before Donald Trump, and of course, increasing very much so with Donald Trump. But for the last 25 years, if you look over the last 25 years for the US border, if you just want to take this one border, if you look just at numbers, right? If you go to the Border and Immigration budget of 1994, it's $1.5 billion under the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. If you fast forward to 2019, the number is, any guesses? Yeah, very close. And you were at the other talk, so I'm sure that's not a guess. That's not a fair. But $24 billion in 1999, what am I talking about? 2019. That is unprecedented, really unprecedented historic growth of the border. This has translated, if you look at Border Patrol agents, they've gone from 4,000 to nearly 21,000. That's a five-fold increase. The amount of technologies or border walls, before Donald Trump even took set foot in the White House, there are 700 miles of walls and barriers along the US-Mexico border. Technologies, billions and billions of dollars of technologies, high-tech cameras, implanted motion sensors with cameras on them, drones, Predator Bs that were used in Afghanistan and Iraq are now doing overflights over the Arizona deserts, equipped with Vader technology like Darth Vader, that was used as quote-unquote man-hunting technology in Afghanistan by the company Northrop Grumman. There's companies that are getting contracts all over the place for different aspects of our border apparatus. The border apparatus in the United States and almost everywhere else is set up in similar fashion, that it blockades traditional crossing places as it has done for 25 years, and then it forces people to circumvent those areas and go into very dangerous and desolate places like the deserts. And that's why there's been 8,000 remains at least found in the US-Mexico borderlands over the last 25 years. And that's why there's boats capsizing in the Mediterranean, and you can go on and on. And so this sort of border apparatus has been growing and growing and growing, and it's projected to grow into the future. And one of the ways you can see this is clearly through market analysis. There's so many private companies making money off border contracts these days that there's analysis looking into the future, like what does this market hold in the future? And if you look at the Homeland Security market, it's pegged to be an over $700 billion global market by 2025. And that's more than doubling from the mid-2010s. It's saying that these sorts of borderscapes and these sorts of border zones are going to be more and more enforced as we move into the future, as we move into the future of more displacement, as we move into the future of more impacts of climate change. Another way that this is being propelled is the U.S. border, as I mentioned briefly, and I'll just mention it briefly again since it's the subject matter of not Storming the Wall, but the new book that Empire of Borders that came out in late 2019. There's an extension, an externalization of the U.S. border that is more prominent than many people realize. The U.S. it's been a key strategy to externalize its border. What I mean by this is that it extends to other countries by various ways, but by training other border patrols, by sending resources, by sending armored vehicles, by sending guns, by sending bullets, and these sort of border operations are going on the Mexico southern border with Guatemala, but also the Guatemalan border with Honduras, also in Honduras along the Nicaraguan border, and in Panama and Colombia and Brazil, and in the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic, and actually overseas as well, in places like Kenya. I visited Kenya, I went to the Jordan Syrian border and watched the Raytheon Corporation putting up a $300 million surveillance system between that border between Jordan and Syria, and also Jordan and Iraq. And the Philippines, again, where there's a lot of maritime security and a lot of investment. Again, the Raytheon Corporation was given $30 million in this case by the U.S. government to build a command and national coastal watch center. So this is an example of this pushing, extending of the borders. And it's done in cooperation with other countries, like the European Union is also doing that. Lots of money for the European Union is going into Turkey and northern African countries like Libya and Morocco and Egypt. And you have a world in totality of borders, right? When you think of the border, like when I said 77 border walls, there's 77 border walls around the world, and if you look where they are, they're positioned between what would you could call the global north and the global south. It's a gigantic border apparatus where the U.S.-Mexico border is just one part of it. And it's countless billions and billions of dollars of technologies, tens of thousands of armed guards, border patrols that have been trained all over the world. And so if you're in places that are being, impacted by many different things, including climate change, most likely if you start heading in certain directions, you're going to start hitting these border regimes. And these are just predicted to be more and more in the future. But to underscore how this is connected with climate change, I want to read a passage from the Pentagon. This is from the Pentagon, a Pentagon Commission report. And this came out in 2003, so mind you, right the very year that the Department of Homeland Security was implemented. And this one says, the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. I remember I forgot to tell you the title of this report. It's called An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implications for United States National Security. And then it says, with diverse growing climates, wealth, technology, and abundant resources, the United States could likely survive shortened growing cycles and harsh weather conditions without catastrophic losses. Borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, and they put an especially severe problem, Mexico and South America. So that was written in 2003. And I always make this comment because I'm sure they meant Central America as well, and there's a lot of geographically challenged people writing these assessments. I've deduced after reading a lot of them myself. But that's just one example. There's been so many assessments there, and even much more polished ones that have pretty much expressed the same thing. Maybe they don't use the word unwanted starving immigrants, but they imply the unwanted starving immigrants, right? One of them was the one called climatic cataclysm, and it came out in 2008, and it was mandated by the U.S. Congress, and it brought military strategists with climate scientists, and they looked at different temperatures and into the future. And one of the things that they stressed in that report, and they looked into 2050, two different temperature scenarios, like 1.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees, and they looked at a 2100 5-degree scenario as possibilities. And one of the things that they stressed in that report was that national security planners need to look 30 years into the future so that the military can anticipate what kind of military hardware to bring to the battlefield. And so with this, I just want to make one quick point, and that's about the Trump administration and Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump, proud denier, says it 100,000 times, almost every day. Every time it's super cold out, he'll make a comment that, called climate change a hoax. But Donald Trump, even though they've scrubbed out climate change from different departments, the government has so many moving parts, and there's, departments that are not deniers at all. And those departments clearly are Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security. And this is the reason why. You have in those departments clear-eyed risk assessors in terms of looking at U.S. national security interests. And there's no way they're going to deny what 97% of scientists are saying. So every assessment you see climate change as a big part of it. And so while the debate stays in this denial smokescreen, the kind of creation of the future is happening, and a long-term planning going behind the scenes for more of what militarized borders, as we're talking about, or more militarization in general. Yeah, so I've lost my train of thought here. So thinking about the future, the future is well planned in that sense, and so you can see like if from that report, the climatic cataclysm in 2007, and then shortly thereafter in 2010 was the first year that the United States declared climate change to be a national security threat, which put into place certain mechanisms such as the quadrennial reviews of the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security then have to include climate change. And quadrennial reviews are the most public statement of mission. So so you look at the landscape of threats, and then they add climate change in there. So if you look at the DHS one, if you look at the 2014 quadrennial review, or if you look at the DHS documents on climate change, and there's plenty of them to look at, around climate adaptation or how they're going to react to climate change, you'll see that they're planning climate change through the 5-point mission. And the 5-point mission of DHS is counterterrorism, immigration enforcement, border enforcement, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure. If you look in those papers, you'll see the very drought that displaced the 3 farmers that I met in Tenosique, the very droughts that are impacting Central America. In fact, 1 year ago, CBP put out another report, and this is Customs and Border Protection, about food shortages in Central America. This goes along the lines of like, there's an extreme awareness of what's going on, but if you look what they say, what they do, according to their 5-point mission, there's no mention of any sort of refugee status. There is a mention of preparing our borders for mass migrations. And so with that, I want to then kind of end looking at one last story. And this story is on the U.S.-Mexico border. And I'll preface this by saying that like thinking about all of this stuff and then thinking again, there's a long-term vision that's in place, that's constantly evolving, that you have national security planners and for the terms of our discussion tonight, it's planning for more and more border militarization, not only in the United States, but around the world. But at the same time, like one of the really, big things that I came across while I was doing research for Storming the Wall and actually my other books is just how many things people are doing around the world in different ways to respond to these different issues. And like one example was the A.G. Sanyo, the muralist who was in the Tacloban Hotel. He actually became a full-fledged climate justice activist right after that. And I actually met him and interviewed him in Paris after he had walked for 60 days in a pilgrimage from Rome to Paris. And he arrived there in late November of 2015, right when the Paris Climate Summit was happening. And so, he was using his art as a part of his climate justice. So that's one example of many. But the example I want to share today actually takes place right on the U.S.-Mexico border. And this, for people who are familiar with the Arizona-Sonora border, this happened right to the east of Agua Prieta, on the Mexican side in a place called San Bernardino Ranch. And I went there where there's binational ecological restoration project happening there by an organization called Cuenca Los Ojos. And so when I got there, the first thing we did was we went to not see their actual ecological restoration project, but to go see where part of the border wall had been dragged in a quarter mile into Mexico. And this happened in 2014 when Hurricane Odile. Actually, Arizona's been getting hurricanes, believe it or not, for the last several years, or remnants of hurricanes. And this particular one, Hurricane Odile, just unleashed water onto the Chiricahua Mountains, and then the water just came through the washes and just slammed into the US-Mexico border and just took parts of the border wall and literally almost all of Arizona has a border wall or border barrier of some sort. And so it dragged it a quarter mile in, and that's the first thing that the Cuenca Los Ojos people took me to see. And so I like to describe this story because it was quite the sight to see this border barrier that was being submerged into the earth. In fact, it looked like the planet was eating it alive, right? It was just gobbling it up. It was half submerged in the dirt. There's flowers growing all over it, purple flowers. There was spider webs all over it. It was literally being taken over. And to me, like at first, I was just like, wow, that's wow. And then, wow, just the awe of it. But then it occurred to me that it's prophetic, right? There it is. The border infrastructure would not stand just Mother Earth would eat it alive. It wouldn't survive on its own. It's not really part of the landscape. But there I was looking at that, but of course they had reconstructed the wall or the barrier where it was before, so you could see it a quarter mile up. You could see a green striped U.S. Border Patrol vehicle. You could see the agent kind of looking at us with binoculars. And then you could see about a mile behind a big surveillance tower. The surveillance tower had been just put up. This surveillance tower had cameras that could see 7.5 miles away. So presumably they could have been watching us. They had a ground sweeping radar that had a radius of 13 miles. So presumably they had us on the radar. And before all this, on the Mexican side, and what I was really there to see was the restoration project, which was, we were in what was called Silver Creek, and in Silver Creek there were gabions. And gabions, for people who don't know what gabions are, they're big steel mesh cages filled with rocks. And those rocks were just stacked on top of each other. So in a way, that almost looked like a intricately stone-carved wall in its own right, compared to the two things. But it wasn't a wall at all. It wasn't a wall. It was a sponge. It was a sponge in the sense that if water came down, the rocks would slow down the water, the soil would drink the water, and then the landscape would be rehabilitated. And that was exactly what was happening. The desert grasses are growing back, the desert willows are growing back, trees are growing back, animals are coming back. And then they said the water table had risen 30 feet. Now, mind you, Arizona, Sonora right now is in a drought. And the droughts are what is being predicted by climate change in Arizona. Excessive heat and less rain and drought. And it's a 15-year drought there. Water tables are simply not rising anywhere, right? And no other subregion are water tables rising. But in this particular one, where they were doing this, it had risen 30 feet. And I said, wow, that's a miracle. And they said, no, it's not a miracle. They said, we just piled up rocks. That's what we did. We piled up rocks. And so the water, of course, it's on the border, so it rose there, and it rose across the border, right? So the people, and right across the border, there's a wildlife refuge called the San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge. Mind you, right now, this is the very place where a wall is being built. At this very moment, a wall is being built in this very area that I'm talking about. But the water rose, and of course, nobody stops the water from rising, crossing the border. And then it was rising in communities to the south in that same subregion. And again, like when you look at the Pentagon assessments for northern Mexico, they say scarcity of water is one of the things that might cause displacement. So you have probably just minor changes, but in places that were losing water, all of a sudden you have a creek running a little bit longer, 3 months instead of 2 months. Water appearing in places that they hadn't appeared in a long time. And now the community's putting in gabions. And you have this. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is just one example, and perhaps a small one, and it's not the only example. But it's an example, and it happened to be right on the U.S.-Mexico border, so you could see the infrastructure. And so much that when I asked one of the founders of Cuenca Los Ojos, what could you do with $20 billion? Now, $20 billion was the Border and Immigration Enforcement that year. What could you do? What could you do with that money? And she, I've said, she just started to talk and gush. She really just gushed, for 5 minutes. And she started talking and talking and talking and talking. I didn't even have my recorder on, which I regret to this very day. But she started talking about how extensive this one project could be, or how many people this one project could impact, and even said this could, with that sort of money. So that's where I want to maybe leave it, thinking about you have this long-term vision of border militarization and militarization in general coming from the Pentagons and the Department of Homeland Securities and around the world, but it seems like there's a lot of fertile ground for counteractions, and I'm sure that everyone here is involved with that already, that seem to need to be coordinated and articulated, and even how much better spent if you're going to face the real existential threats to humankind right now. When you just to think of that one example, what is a better for the well-being of human beings in general, the sort of binational cooperation, cross-border coming together to maybe form something new, or the billions of dollars of fortifications of technologies and border militarization.
Bangladesh has 150 million people, and just south of India. And I've heard it said by environmentalists that they're one of the first countries to experience catastrophic flooding. And in response to that, I've heard at least 2 or 3 times where India is building a wall along the Bangladesh border to keep those 150 million people out. And the second thing I want to say is, I know you're talking about border stuff and things, but about a year and a half ago, a man named Dr. David Pauly spoke at UC Berkeley. He was touted as one of the best authorities on oceans. And at the end of his lecture, he said because of acidification, he said that there was no hope for the oceans, that there will be no life in the oceans within 100 years. Maybe you could respond to that.
Here? Is it you? I didn't pay.
He wants to take 2 questions.
Okay. I'm going to read one thing right here from the Long-Term Climate Risk Index, which are listed by a think tank in environmental investigations. The 10 most affected countries from, like I said, Long-Term Climate Risk Index were Puerto Rico, #1, Honduras, Myanmar, Haiti, Philippines, Nicaragua, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, Dominica. Okay? You don't have to go too far, actually. Puerto Rico is an American colony. And we felt and suffered the effects to the extent, even we were withheld funds for reconstructions and passed over to border construction. If you have read even the simple capitalist press. And while the hurricane, Maria, which affected, I'm a survivor, actually. Some people right here even saw me before I left for a trip down there. The security capitalist enterprise called Academy, which used to be Blackwater at one point, and X afterwards, was doing security, so-called security work over there, getting paid by the millions, and all these corruptions in, giving contracts to corporations like Whitefish, which was like a 2-3 person enterprise. So, you don't have to go too far to Asia or whatever. In the heart of the empire, it happens like, these catastrophes, we are risk, like I demonstrated, a long-term climate change catastrophe. Right now we're suffering earthquakes almost every day. If you look at the press, the last one happened, a couple of days ago, 4.0. So, you need international solidarity. I mean, and the responsibility of the workers of the hearts of the empire is fight against their own capitalist class and support the struggles of the people in the colony and the countries that are oppressed by the capitalists of this country. Thank you. Main enemies.
Thanks for your comments. That's and I'm about to go to Puerto Rico in like a week or so for a wedding, actually. So, yeah, I know. I'm gonna. Yeah, and to go to your questions, like Bangladesh, that Bangladesh is one of the. I remember when I was researching Storming the Wall that there was projections like 1 to 2 million people, but there was a general, a 3-star general named Stephen Cheney who said he talked to some generals in Bangladesh and said that they were anticipating 20 million people to be displaced, the militaries, and that India has built a very, I can't remember how long, the 700 miles is coming to mind, but I'm not, that seems very, very long, so I would want to double check that. But a very big and long border wall, and a border wall that's reinforced by a border patrol called the Border Security Force, BSF. And the BSF has been known to shoot and kill. So there's been a number of Bangladeshis who've been killed on that border as well. So I haven't looked into it more than that, but I know that that's definitely that's actually one of the places to look where you have a climate catastrophes and borders coming, one right after the other.
Hello again. I was wondering if you could talk about different companies that are getting these contracts, because I read, I think just yesterday, that Amazon had a contract with ICE, I think, to provide technology, and I was wondering if there are other tech companies or kind of the web that's creating this border apparatus and giving them technology.
Okay. Yeah, there's a ton. A lot of companies. There's companies, the big military companies that I'm sure everyone's heard of. They have all gotten border contracts. For example, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. They did the Vader technology that I mentioned. General Dynamics, General Atomics. There's a number of companies, and the amount of I was doing calculations on this recently, and if you took the accumulated budgets of border and immigration enforcement from the year 1978 to 1997, it comes to $27 billion. That is the amount of money that has gone to contracts to companies from the year 2008 to 2019. That's from CBP alone, Customs and Border Protection. There's been 65,000 contracts given out, and those big military companies are some of the are some of the biggest contractors, but there's others. There's tech companies. There's companies. There's a lot of like security tech companies or a lot of like if you look at the biometric markets, they're going up and up and up. Biometrics mean facial recognition and iris recognition and that sort of thing. And then if you follow the money, these companies are always, the same ones giving out campaign contributions to key congressional figures and certain committees, like the Appropriations Committee that determines how money gets doled out, or the House Homeland Security Committee, or when the appropriation cycles are happening, these are the companies that are doing intense lobbying for more and more budgets. So if you look at the budgets growing and growing and growing and growing and growing year after year after year, you can see that at least part of the reason why is that behind the scenes, there's a real push by companies that are getting border contracts and want more border contracts. And so what I would argue is that there's a very serious border industrial complex. And that's I think we have to look at that, and that's a thing we have to tackle.
Thanks again for the talk. It's kind of more of a comment, and then there's going to be a question at the end of it. But you're kind of talking about ways in which that they frame these issues, the U.S. government, as Homeland Security, as in they're trying to protect people that are living in the United States. But I think you see that that's totally BS when you see the kind of effects of climate change that have happened, domestically, where we look at things like Hurricane Katrina, where what the federal government was doing in New Orleans was basically arresting people that were trying to, loot stores that were very poor. And you see immediately the government and these forces' role is to actually defend property and defend, the wealth of the people that really have power in this society. Same thing with these wildfires. You see there's absolutely no response, no infrastructure, no planning to actually help people here. So I think we have to kind of reframe this. It's not Department of Homeland Security, it's Department of Security for the rich and the privileged and the 1% is what they're doing this planning for. So connected to that kind of comment, I was wondering if you can speak to ways that, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been complicit in this, because there's this kind of thing that, this is Trump's program and stuff like that. But can you speak a little bit more about how both parties have kind of consciously grown this apparatus?
Yeah, it's been both parties. That's how it's been. I mean, you look how it's grown over the last 25 years, and it really and I'm talking, I mean, it was growing before that, but the real huge growth really started with the Bill Clinton administration in the mid-1990s or 1994 or 1993. And you can look up Operations Hold the Line, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard, all that just putting tons of money into the border and just that's when walls started, the first, like they took out the chain link fence in Nogales and put a wall in built with landing mats from the Vietnam and Persian Gulf Wars, and hired lots of new Border Patrol agents and brought in new technologies and really started the prevention through deterrence strategy during the Clinton administration. So you have the Clinton administration, this first wave, then you have the post 9/11 George W. Bush administration, which what happened with that was that with the Department of Security for the rich, or however you put it. So, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, you have the mission became a counterterror mission and became the priority mission. And while there has been no evidence of any sort of people crossing the U.S. border that are considered terrorists by the U.S. government, it opened up the floodgates for all kinds of money to go in. So money just poured in to border and immigration enforcement during the Bush administration. And then the Obama administration, there was some optimism at the beginning of the Obama administration that this administration might, curtail some of, when you look at the Bush administration, the budgets went up to nearly $14 billion for border and immigration enforcement. But with the Obama administration, really, they just carried on and built it up even more. In fact, as we know, with the Obama administration, deportations really, they got to record levels. There were several years in a row where more than 400,000 people were deported per year, nearly 3 million people in total during the Obama administration, and the nickname was earned deporter in chief, right? And so by the time the Trump administration, even like by the time Trump set foot in the White House in 2017, the budget was already $20 billion. So that it had gone from 1.5 billion as an annual to 20 billion. And so you could see that was a bipartisan buildup. And in many ways, you know, through all these different administrations, but also for votes, like, can you believe, like right now, the border wall, I don't think you can find a Democrat that would say they would vote for a border wall, right? Maybe there would be one or two, I don't know. But if you go back to when there was an actual vote for a border wall bill, which was in 2006, the Secure Fence Act of 2006, who do you think voted for that? Barack Obama voted for that. Hillary Clinton voted for that. Chuck Schumer voted for that. And those are three prominent Democrats. So the kind of votes for what has been termed border security, right? This idea of border security, which, as you correctly analyzed, it's an inaccurate and incorrect term to use the word security, but at the same time, it's really useful for political speak, or if you're a politician, to say you're against something that's security, that you're risking, right? Oh, how could you be against security? Or if you Google tonight, if you go put in quotes, I'm for border security, but you'll find a lot of Democrats actually saying those sorts of things. So yes, so the border buildup, which is often thought to be exclusively in the hands of the Republicans, is really not. It's been very bipartisan. And I would argue that Trump is a manifestation of all those years of buildup in a lot of ways. And of course, this doesn't, the Trump administration is now taking it to further limits of cruelty. It's pushing the limits as far as it can, but it comes from a foundation of a very much of bipartisan buildup.
So it seems like the more the administration denies climate change, the more a fair amount of liberal types seem to look to the military positively, because at least the military is paying attention. And yeah. I think there's a lot of people who would be susceptible to really throwing their weight behind draconian militarized immigration policy if it's marketed as being for the environment, or necessary action on climate change or something. And so I just wondered what you think about that kind of prospect for eco-fascism, if you will.
Yeah, there's a movie out there called The Age of Consequences, and have you seen that movie? Yeah, that's exactly. I actually met the filmmakers. We were at a similar conference, and I was doing research for Storming the Wall, and I remember talking to them, and they were exactly that. They're like, so the military is totally on board with climate change, and so we're going to make this movie, and we think that's going to help influence other people, like shake people out of denialism and really make people think it's important because the military thinks it's important. And then, of course, the next sentence that could have been stated is like, then we're going with the military policies that goes right along with climate change. And yeah, I mean, like doing the research for this book, when you're commenting, there's one particular quote that came to mind. It was from this admiral, and he was at one of these conferences, and he was talking about climate mitigation and getting off the addiction to fossil fuels and cutting the tether of fossil fuels, as James Mattis said. But he said, well, this is how he put it. We think about the polar bears, and he may use that. He's like, the polar bears, and that's all nice and all, but we have other reasons why we want to, cut the tether of fossil fuels. And, it's going to be good for the environment, and that's great. But the thing that and he goes on and on, he says a number of examples like that, and then finally gets to the point, and he says, but the thing that we're really thinking about is that, when we're dealing with fossil fuels, like when we're in Iraq, we have to rely on fuel trucks going in and out. We have to rely on this, and we're just bogged down by it. And so if we're to move to more renewable energy, then we will become more, and he used this word exactly, we will become more lethal. We'll become more lethal, and we'll be able to strike quicker, we'll be able to move faster. And that's when I think of what your comment, that's exactly what I think of, is that sort of, we become more lethal, we can do more, move faster in these, as a militarized force, for whatever reason.
I have a comment and then a question. So I was on the Texas-Mexico border a few months ago at the National Butterfly Center.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people have been following this because they're very much in the center of the border wall fight. This is outside of McAllen, Texas, and they are situated between several wildlife preserves, the Santa Ana Wildlife Preserve, and a few others. And Mariano Trevino Wright is a hero, frankly. And so I was down there at their annual Butterfly Festival, and she was telling us that, in fact, so one thing is that the wall can be built 1 to 2 miles north of the river, and that the government can basically claim all the land between the wall and the river, and they can completely clear it of all vegetation and all life once the wall gets built. And she was saying that that is actually related to natural gas, and that there is an LNG, one or more, in Brownsville, Texas, and that they're doing the fracking in western part of Texas. And that part of what this can be about is once they build the wall and then they have this land cleared that no one can access, then they can actually bring a pipeline through that. So I was curious if you have had any contact with her and if you've heard anything about this. And it was interesting, you were talking about fossil fuels, because the fossil fuels actually factored into this, and I never would have thought of that as one more thing. Oh, but she did say, too, that even though the federal government is giving lip service or being climate deniers, they totally know it's real, and that's what this is about, is building the wall so people can't come across. So.
Shit. Do you want? Okay. All right.
Yeah, I was wondering, I personally look at places like, let's say, China or Vietnam or Cuba as liberated territory, places where the imperialists can't do what they would like to do. And I'm just wondering, have you noticed, because when you talk about this border, what do you say? He says it's a border like industrial that sounds like some shit, I don't want to say white folks, but let me say the capitalists would do, the white capitalists, the racist capitalists would do. That's, to try to cash in on every type of human misery. But I was wondering, in terms of China, Vietnam, Laos, they're next to countries where they have extreme weather events. Do people ever try to cross the border to go into China, or, because I don't know, this is really a question, or Vietnam, and if so, how do they deal with this? Do they have that ultra militarized type of thing going on, or do they let them stay? Or, what is their reaction to migrants that are generated from climate events, climate crisis events?
I'll try to answer, but I'll try to answer. Actually, with the first of all, the China question, I'm not sure. I know that there's areas where there's checkpoints and that sort of thing. What? Yeah, the Philippines is close to China. I'm not, but from what I understand, I'm not like, as far as migration going into China, I'm not quite sure. I know that, I do know that there's checkpoints in certain areas. I know that there's around Tibet. There's different checkpoint areas. But I don't feel like I don't know the answer to your question. So, but it definitely makes me want to look into it. And I don't know if somebody else might have an answer to that question. But, right. So there's, from what I understand, there's like a checkpoint system going on and different things like that. And as far as what's going on in South Texas, I do know Mariana from the Butterfly Center. I did not know about the pipeline, but it's not surprising. Like, we have pipelines going through southern Arizona as well, and that sort of dynamic isn't surprising. I know that they're in a fight for their lives there in the Butterfly Center and many other places around the border wall construction. And I know that Mariana is getting, and the Butterfly Center are getting threats on a daily basis. They're getting so many threats. If you just go look at their Twitter account, they're just getting trolled and threatened constantly. And it's interesting too, like in southern Texas, where there's a river, you have the Rio Grande, and one of the interesting things, the boundary being the river, is the river's always moving, right? And so thus they are actually literally building the wall where the wall's built, a mile inland. So you have neighborhoods or houses of people trapped between the walls, the actual wall and the border. And so that's the real interesting dynamic there. What?
They have a GoFundMe for their current lawsuit. Anyway, I have forms if anybody wants the URL.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Hi. To answer Gerald's question, I just made a trip to Asia. I went to New Ireland, New Britain, a little bit out towards like the eastern archipelago, kind of like where the islands end when you get to East Timor. You know what I'm saying? In that part of like those chain of islands that Indonesia is involved in. Then I made a trip up through Malaysia, the Indochinese Peninsula, and then up into China. So from my understanding, most of the climate refugees are based in Indonesia at this point. The smaller islands are being eviscerated. They're just kind of being drowned. So they're moving to the bigger islands. Jakarta is going to be underwater. So, Indonesia they're setting up their new capital. Not all the planning has been totally established around that. So people are kind of nervous. Jakarta still functions, it seems like. From when I was there, it's still kind of working as a city. But, like, you can't have new buildings. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't plan new projects. You've got to, if you need something new, you've got to plan it for the new capital, and that seems like that's part of the program there. It seems like basically all the small islands that are coming for that train through Indonesia and East Timor or whatever they're disappearing, so people have to move to the smaller islands, and then eventually they have to move to the continent. In terms of migration to China, that seems pretty tough to do unless you're Han. If you're Han Chinese, then it's a lot easier from what I'm able to gather, but if you're from like another indigenous group, they're not as compatible with that. Even in Hong Kong, when I was there, I was in Kowloon, which is like kind of on the northern side of the city, and there's like I don't speak all the languages there, but I was talking to people. Most of them know English. What I was basically able to gather is like if you're Han Chinese, and you're identifiably Han Chinese, they let you in. I think the situation in Xinjiang is kind of informative to this. That they're kind of forming they're sort of using a model from the way that the U.S. conquered Latin America through the use of white supremacist structure, and they're trying to form their own sort of like Han supremacist structure, if that makes sense. I know that sounds kind of weird, but that's kind of what I saw over there, where sort of like if you are Han, if you have Han last name, if you look Han, then, you get treated way differently than somebody who's Hmong or somebody who, is from is like Timorese or like coming from one of the island areas. But I think that hasn't really hit the critical mass that it has maybe in Latin America. I also think not all of the migration necessarily, not to seem like you study it more than I have, but I don't think all of the migration is totally climate related at this point. I think a lot of it is like culture related and just people kind of knowing people who, living up here and doing better. You know what I'm saying? Just from people I've known. I might be wrong. But yeah, it will hit a critical mass, I think, at some point, because Indonesia is getting swallowed faster than any other country. I mean, they're changing their capital right now. It's literally the thing. You go to Jakarta, and that's like everybody's talking about it, how they're changing the capital. So there will be a migration north towards China, and they'll have to figure it out. But anyway, sorry, I don't want to hog the time.
Thank you. I was really glad you brought up the Gabions, is that how you pronounce it, on the other side of the border, and that 5-minute download that this woman shared with you. That's precious stuff. And I also appreciate the new name for the Department of Homeland Security, the Department for the Security of the 1%. You've given us this image of billions and billions of dollars, basically the money of all the people who produce in this country, this huge surplus that we're spending in order to maintain the destruction of the planet and protect the 1%. And we have to organize to take that back. We have to have Gabions in that other 5 minutes, and then all the other extraordinary plans that so many scientists have come up with to invest that money in that which will save life on Earth. And I just really appreciate that example as a starting point for us to think about why it's so important for us to organize now to take it back, because we have everything at stake here. So that's all, just a comment.
Thanks.
He asks about how other countries like Cuba deal with natural disasters or climate change. Actually, the island, the country in the Caribbean that has dealt better with natural disasters and climate change has been Cuba. And particularly, they have been hit by hurricanes like we have in Puerto Rico. But instead of depending on private enterprises and private capitalists to deal with things, the Cubans themselves, they don't need these intermediaries. They're small resources they have been able to mobilize, and you never anywhere see the casualties or the people being killed in the natural disasters up to 4,000 like in Puerto Rico or 3,000 like any other country. And you don't hear anything about, people dying of malnourished, aftermath of the hurricanes. And that's a fact of life. I can prove it. I mean, it's plenty of evidence, plenty of literature that the armed forces particularly are used in civic affairs dealing with natural disasters better than any Latin American country, and even this nasty empire during Katrina and so on.
That's right. It's called Committees of the Revolution.
Any new comments, questions?
I have a couple of questions. First of all, very often when I'm in discussions online, I feel like I have to sort of come up with arguments against all these various people who have mostly what's called climate denying positions. And is there a resource online, a website particularly, where you can sort of go to find the answers to all the basic kinds of objections that are raised, so I don't have to constantly remember the arguments? And okay, that's my first thing. The other thing is, I'd be interested in information about people engaging in very militant direct action, including sabotage, against the people whose, the industries that are causing, contributing to the disaster. I won't say causing because there's so many different, so many different activities that contribute to it, but particularly against the fossil fuel industry and coal and so on. I'm interested in knowing more about direct action and how to support it. And when I say direct action, I include sabotage, I say. I don't think it has to be nice and peaceful.
Hi, okay, so I'm just wondering, do we have an action plan of what to do for this climate change that's happening so rapidly, all around the world? I mean, do we actually have a plan of how to reduce it or how to stop it? Or is it just going to keep going on, and then we just have to find new resources to do such things as this? I mean, like with the wall of bricks, I think that's great if you add an irrigation system to it, so that if the water rises to a certain level, it'll be distributed throughout the land, like they usually do, with farming. I'm not exactly sure if that would work. I've never tried it before, but it sounds like something that'd be possible. So, what is the action plan for the future, for the next? If the military does the next maybe 30, 40 years, what is ours?
All right. All right.
Someone else first?
Okay, well,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we don't have a particular blueprint, but just like anything, if you take maybe a medical model and you look at the question of vectors of disease, where are things coming from, it's all roads lead back to, in this case, the functioning of a system that places no value on the things that you're talking about. And that the first thing is life. The only reason that life is valued under a capitalist system is if there's a way to generate a profit from it. So we hear constantly, this many dollars in Puerto Rico, this many dollars here and there. What's happened is a devastation of the environment, entire ecosystems, the human beings and other animals that live there, the plant systems. So there is no other solution than to find a way to begin to mobilize our forces to go up against this system. You have somebody like little Greta Thunberg, who's 15 years old, Climate Strike for Peace, now she's turned 17. She has captured the imagination of millions of people because she won't back down, but she's still talking to the people who are responsible as if we can hold them accountable. We can't. These people are locked into a system at this point of mass murder, mass destruction, and the only possibility is for the people who actually make society run to take that not back, but take it under our control, because it's never been under our control. In the same way that the United States has never been great for anybody but that 1/10 or 1,000th of 1%. So what we have to do is be active where we are, build organizations that have the possibility to give a different perspective when people start moving. Otherwise, we just repeat the same thing, placing demands on the same people who stand at the head of a system that's only going to destroy us. And we can see our common interests. It's very easy to see that. We listen to this, we know it. So, as he said at the beginning, talk to somebody and speak out. We're trying, and we're taking the beginning steps. So who gets that?
Thank you for your talk. I was going to say something similar to the gentleman in the back that just spoke, because it seemed like your example with the, what did you call them, gambiones? And then you asked the woman a question about, what if you had X amount of money, what would you do to it? As if the solution is to throw money. And I disagree with that. I think that we need to start to figure out what is it that people are willing to change, and it might not be related to the environment, but if we understand the system and the way that it functions, then we eventually will help our environment around us, whether it be like better for schools or better for healthcare or things like that. But I think the problem that many people see or hear is they come to these lectures or they see the news and like it's such a big problem and they don't know what to do. And you know, I hear the woman on the side of me asking like, do we have a plan? Is there a plan? But I mean, we have to look at ourselves and think about what we're ready to do besides throw money or just come to lectures. Anyhow, thank you.
Can I respond? Yeah, I'd like to respond. Yeah, thanks for your point, and that really makes sense. And what I just want to clarify that when I use a $20 billion figure, that was the only reason I used that figure was because that was the border and immigration enforcement budget. So this simultaneously using that figure was about transferring that money from one thing to another, rather than like just throwing money, and that's the idea. The whole implied in that is a demilitarization of the border, because right now you have a border apparatus that just the plan in place right now is a border apparatus that grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, and you can look at it in many different ways. One of the ways you can look at it is money, and that particular example was just an example of one of many examples to put out there that, you know, there are different things that can be done. There's different ways that people can come together. In this case, it was the people coming together across borders, so I thought it was a particularly good one. And really, in the end of the day, it's like piling up rocks using ancient wisdom to do so, to respond to a situation of drought that's been like that for 15 years, and it's actually functioning. So I think it's a particularly good example. But it's only one of many, and it's very small scale. And the only reason why you like to use money figures is that's the budgets of the border and immigration apparatus. And then to talk about the plan, right? There is the big plan, right? The Paris Agreement, right? That's the big internationally touted plan that is non-binding, that's insufficient, that even if all the countries, like it has this whole master plan of countries mitigating their, you know, the whole mitigation plan that still, so by some calculations, will end up at 3.5 degree centigrade heating of the planet. So you have these like different plans out, but then at the end of the day, and I think it responds to a number of points. You have these summits that have gone on for 25 years, right? You have these summits, and these summits are based on countries or nation states, like the division of how the world is right now into nation states, of countries that come together who are supposed to respond to this existential crisis. And 25 years later, in 2019, there's more greenhouse gas emissions than ever before, and that's inexcusable. It's like it's a complete like failure to respond to a situation. And what to me that says, the implication therein is that there has to be, it's almost like she was saying over there, that it's time to stop waiting for something to happen from other entities that are not responding to the situation at hand. And it's really time to start, like, you know, coming together and building something completely new, and it's going to come from below, and that's how it's going to be, because it's simply not coming from above. And that's and what that plan is there are a lot of different plans out there already. There's things that are existing, and from projects to movements to like the whole climate youth movement going on, Extinction Rebellion. There's all kinds of different things going on. That's all. And what happens if these different movements are articulated together? Like, I don't know what the plan is, but there's the foundations there, and there's more and more awareness. And I really think like watching what youth movements are doing right now is probably a really good place to look.
Hi, again. I guess one question that I had, and if you could go back a bit into your memories of talking to different people in these areas that have been most affected. What was the level of awareness of the people that you met that this forced migration was related to climate change? And I also wonder if people, once they have their homes destroyed, I guess, leaving is the only option, but and people who haven't been seriously affected, do they felt they had options of how to deal with the issue? And if there were options, what options did they felt they had besides migrating?
Well, so there's a lot of different scenarios of people, that I in which people that I talked to, and some were just. I remember talking to a 18-year-old man on the U.S.-Mexico border who had crossed the border, and actually almost died crossing the border. He was walking for nearly 2 days, and then he made his way back to Mexico, and that's where I ended up talking to him. And it turns out the reason why he was going was directly related to what he said: 40 days and 40 nights without rain, crops completely wilted, and he was going to try to reunite with his brothers who are in Dallas, Texas. And so you have stories. I'm hearing more and more stories like that, like the train yard story where no rain was, was the number one reason. But then there's other people where there's another reason that's higher, right? And it could be a number of different things, including, especially in cities, like fleeing insecure situations and situations of violence, or it could be like economic distress. And a lot of times economic distress and the climate, it comes in as an exacerbating thing. There's one story from a person I talked to from Nicaragua who talked about Hurricane Mitch, and Hurricane Mitch caused these. In fact, his whole community was completely buried by a mudslide because of Hurricane Mitch. And in his case, and many of the people in his community, they spent 2 years trying to rebuild their community, 2 years, and then after 2 years of doing that, he finally said, I can't do it anymore. And so they tried a number of different things. They were able to get some money at one point for some rebuilding assistance and this and that and the other thing, but it was never enough. And then he finally decided 2 years later to go north. And I know there's more stories like that where things happen and people attempt to do many different things to rehabilitate situations or build houses back again, or if maybe you have some food stored when the harvest doesn't come, or you can get food assistance of some sort, or there's many other things that people can do, but going north becomes one option of several things. But that's when you have the possibilities of getting a job or something, going north. It's become one of many options. But I'd like to see, I think I'm only giving you probably scratching the surface of all the things that people do and all the ways that communities come together. And I know there's a lot of solidarity in communities, especially when situations hit and people come together, and it'd be interesting to look at those stories more in depthly.